Thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Cornelius Fletcher. I'm the Associate Regional Director of State Legislative Affairs for the Midwest with Everytown for Gun Safety. I am tasked with directing our policy strategy for Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Today I'm joined by two of my more favorite colleagues to talk about a community trauma report that our research team put together on the effects of gun violence in the Black community, as well as a report that we put together earlier this year on the economic cost of gun violence. Something that I've been rolling around in my head on our issue area this week as we talk about how all of these issues affect our communities, is I can look around this room and know that at least the majority of us have had some type of interaction with gun violence in this country and in our communities, and how non-Black members of society can go their whole lives and not experience gun violence on a scale that we do in our own communities. And we talk about the ways that we can affect that from a nonprofit standpoint, and also ways that we can help you as legislators combat that issue. I will say, to take a personal point of privilege, how honored I am to be a part of NBCSL this week, to be a part of the fellowship with lawmakers and my colleagues. All I have ever wanted was the love and acceptance of my people, and I appreciate you all for allowing me to be here with my colleagues and our organization and talk to you all a little bit about what we do and how we can help you. So I am joined here with Angela Farrell-Zabala, a colleague of mine with Everytown for Gun Safety. She's been with us since 2019 and currently heads our organization's movement building division. In this role, she's responsible for both leading and growing the largest grassroots network in the gun violence prevention space with our volunteer group, Moms Demand Action. She also oversees our external engagement and programmatic work, which consists of cultural engagement, corporate engagement, and partnerships in national programs. And prior to Everytown, Angela spent some time with Planned Parenthood Federation of America, as well as the Religious Coalition and Reproductive Choice Center as the Director of Field Operations. We also have with us today Keenan James, who serves as the Senior Director of the Everytown Survivor Network. Mr. James is a gun violence survivor and leads the Everytown Survivor Network to elevate real-life stories of millions of Americans impacted by gun violence, also working to enact legislation to make communities safer. So the crux of these two reports is that there are scars that you can see and scars that you cannot see in our communities. The scars that you can see is obviously the loss of life, the loss of life of our young men and women in our communities. The scars that you can't see is the economic cost of gun violence. We spend over $280 billion responding to gun violence in this country, $280 billion. A weekend of gun violence in any given city could cost taxpayers over $100 million. And that is in Dallas, Chicago. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. We led the nation for years in gun homicides. And you think about the impact that it not only has to our mental, our physical, our abilities to engage with each other socially, but then also the economic impact that it has on our communities. And so one of the first questions I have for our panelists is, what were your biggest takeaways from the trauma report that our research team put together, and what are the ways that we are working to combat some of those issues?
Yeah, thank you, Cornelius. And much like you said, I'm really honored to be here. Thank you all for joining us. I think first I want to start with a few statistics. I mean, we hear a lot of those in every issue that impacts us. Statistics are the center of it, and I just want to name off a few. First of all, Black people in this country are 10 times more likely than white folks to die by gun homicide. Secondly, every 11 minutes, a Black person is shot and wounded in this country. Approximately every 3 hours, a young black man dies by gun violence, gun homicide in the U.S. And then lastly, we're 21 more times more likely to be shot and killed by police than our white counterparts in this country. So with all of that being said, when we think about trauma, oftentimes, you hear that word related to many things, including like our veterans coming home, military, all kinds of things, mental health. And oftentimes in those types of things, even after a natural disaster, you are able to have some resolution. So you're taken out of an environment. So for instance, trauma that follows hurricanes, major disasters, fires, you can be removed from the environment and then a healing process can take place. But in our communities, it is constant and persistent. So the environmental impact is constantly there. And so there's no real space to actually have what you need to be able to really heal from it. So that was really, it's one of those things that we kind of all know intuitively, but to see that written out and understand what that looks like is really, incredibly challenging. I also think it's important just to note the different dimensions of violence that kind of lead into the trauma. We're talking about interpersonal and individual violence. We're talking about community violence. We're also talking about historical and intergenerational violence. So the report is, if you didn't get to read it, we want to make sure that you get a copy of it. It's really, really interesting. But that's what stands out for me, Cornelius.
Good morning. Again, Keenan James, and it's certainly my pleasure to be here. And the report gets into the trauma and the impact, but I would say I have to personalize that impact. July 15th, 1993 is a day that changed my life and my family's life forever, because that was the day that the Prince George's County Police Department knocked on our door to let me know that my brother had been shot and killed. And that trauma continues to grow and grow and grow. And as I look at it from a legislative perspective, one of the things that continues to impact me 28 years later is that it's still an unsolved crime. Still an unsolved crime. And so when I come through these holidays and other events and we get together, I continue to relive that without that little bit of, because it's not actually closure, it's not actually justice, it's just information. And sometimes we think, well, we need to give a family closure. You can't, because you can't give a person their family member back. You can't have them accept it, because I don't accept what happened, because it does not have to happen in our communities. And that trauma extends. And I look at it from that perspective as the report highlights. For me, I look at the report and it talks about choices and decisions and how it impacts a child. I nearly failed the 7th grade just because I wouldn't participate. I just didn't feel like talking to anyone that entire year. That is what almost changed the complete trajectory of my life, was that I did not feel like talking to someone. And in our communities, we often lack the resources that allow us to address that trauma. In our community specifically, we don't even like to talk about the presence of that trauma. And one of the things that the report highlights and it talks about is, how do mothers address that trauma when they feel that they'll be stigmatized surrounding, well, what happened to your child? Well, what happened was he or she was shot. That doesn't make it acceptable. Just as if for men, it's often justified to suppress grief. And then that manifests later on. And we see it manifest when it comes to jobs and economic growth. And for me, when I say it just in our community, it's the motivation. But as the report highlights, some of those things that we can do to make changes, to really address those structural traumas, can really be something that legislators look at. And they can be outside the box. They can really be outside the box. We've talked about, just in law enforcement perspective, what things can change. And looking into some other conversations, prior to this position, I served as Deputy Director of NOBLE, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And we talked about a lot of things. How are we using police resources? In particular, for mental health calls, can we reuse those resources? Well, I challenge you to think outside the box, even in the sense of gun violence and those types of notifications. Is a police officer really the person that needs to make that notification? Or does someone who's more trained to deal with responding to the mental health needs of a family need to be there? just an idea that may free up police resources to do what we often think about is police work. But we can also make sure that our community has the appropriate resources. When I think about those police officers that I work with, they often show up and they give you this information, and you're in the middle of processing the fact that you just lost a loved one. And they've handed you some information about victims' resources that I guarantee you 30 seconds after it was given to you, you didn't even remember it was in your hand. And then there are barriers to those victims later on when they try to access resources that they had no idea were available because you gave them information at the most inopportune time. But there are things that we can do, looks at processes and procedures that are no cost, low cost, that really address that trauma and help us strengthen our communities because it is a long-lasting, lifelong trauma.
I just want to just quickly thank you, first of all, for sharing your story. And I think one of the things that stood out and that you're reminding me is that there is direct impact and there's indirect impact. So it doesn't matter if this is, I mean, it matters, but the point is you losing a loved one is direct impact, but the community is still harmed by that, the whole community.
Absolutely, and one of the things I think about that for me, I even take it back to my own situation and say the whole cul-de-sac lost their son. I lived in a cul-de-sac with 5 homes, but the next door neighbor, their son lost his best friend. And the neighbor next to that lost the young man that he had been coaching for many years. And the neighbor next to that lost the young man who had been cutting their grass. And the neighbor next to that lost the young man that they would see, and they had just had a child. Well, that changes your perspectives on parenting and how guarded will I be with my child. The whole community, the whole cul-de-sac may be impacted, and that carries on for many, many years.
Thank you for that. And to that point, we talk about being a survivor of gun violence, and the way that every town classifies survivors of gun violence is pretty unique in that it's not only someone who has actually been struck by a bullet, it is the friends and family members of people who know that person, who have lost a loved one. I myself identify as a survivor of gun violence, having lost friends to gun violence as early as 15 and as recent as this past summer. And I know many of you in this room also identify as survivors of gun violence yourselves. And so I oftentimes when I am in a state house and I am talking to lawmakers about this issue in a state house in Wisconsin or in a state house in Ohio, I hear that is an issue for Cleveland. That is an issue for Milwaukee. That is an issue for Dallas, and the code there is that is a black issue, and that is an urban issue. Now, I think since we are here today talking about our communities, what are the benefits of talking about black trauma as it pertains to gun violence in our communities, since it is being thrust on us to kind of take care of ourselves in a lot of these instances?
Well, we already know that the disproportionate impact, so I think it's important not to talk about this as a one-size-fits-all. I'd even go in even further, not just talking about it as far as black community and black people, but as you were just noting, different cities and communities need different approaches. I think it's so important to do that, and I also think what I'm really proud of, especially what we've done in our organization, is really to kind of, as we've moved along fairly young in this movement, but to really look to the solutions coming from the people most impacted. So making sure that we have on the ground violence interruption programs and other things that we can actually partner with by helping to allocate resources or whatever they need. But I do really think what makes this really unique, or what's really appropriate about that, is you get to really customize the solutions because it's multifaceted and no one community is going to necessarily be the same.
I think we definitely have to accept the disproportionate impact, but also phrase it in a way that the majority is impacted. And when I think about that, I think about wounded survivors, and I think about some of the mothers that I have who are caring for loved ones who are paralyzed, and they're trying to get simple health care needs, simple access to health care that isn't readily available. And so we often think about just the incident itself and the weapon itself, but there are lots of gun violence survivors who are parents and loved ones who have to endure navigating the bureaucracy of caring for their loved one. And that is something that we can personalize as well and again, an opportunity to take down barriers that often limit access to some of those resources as well.
And I would say the solutions, when we're talking about this, Keenan, is, again, when I talk about multifaceted, it is absolutely violence, and it's absolutely figuring out the guns. We have one of the things that we are really working on at Everytown now is the ghost guns, the prevalence of ghost guns. But beyond even just the firearm, which is our bread and butter at our organization, it's all the other structural impacts that lead us to this. So we're talking about housing, job security, healthcare. You're talking about that, not just when someone is impacted by the violence, but leading up to a place where communities are in this kind of distress. So it's important for us to kind of see across those different issues and understand that this is all tied together and related.
So that's a great point to talk about the way that some of these other issues intersect. We talk about economic disparities in our communities, food insecurity, the police accountability in our communities, and how do you think these issues lend themselves to gun violence and Black trauma in our communities? For instance, how does police brutality worsen the trauma that is already plaguing our communities in gun violence?
The notion or even the daring term to use of police violence is almost taboo. You know, to how dare you say police violence? Well, if I look at it and I take the incident and I use the Webster's dictionary, it meets the definition. And so those relationships we know already are strained from the beginning. Now, real talk, body cameras and the internet have only exacerbated that situation. And so what we have commonly talked about within the house is now on the internet. And so there has to be accountability in the police violence as well. The use of your weapon versus, the hours that officers put in for their weapons training versus de-escalation training. Well, there's something that's going on there. There is a lot that has to be addressed, understanding officers that may have a propensity to use violence. And those are things that are being addressed in many states, but we can't just talk about it. We have to implement some of those solutions because they build those bridges of trust. Just as we talk about implementing and looking at different solutions, education is one of those areas. We have to invest in our educational systems that help empower our communities as well. So building on those trust bridges is going to be extremely important, but acknowledging that they exist in some areas, that there is that mistrust and that police violence is not acceptable either, is something that we definitely have to address.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about when you just shared your story earlier, Keenan, and you mentioned how your trajectory was and could have been even more impacted, what your future would be. And it makes me think of my own son. I'm a mother of 4. I have 1 boy and 3 girls. And my son is now 20, but I want to say probably 4 years or so ago, we were just talking about future. What do you want to do? You want to go to college? What does it look like? Family, all that. And he said to me, "Oh, if I make it that long." Like and it was just, I was almost paralyzed. I didn't know what he was talking about. What do you mean if you make it that long? He's like, if I make it past 25. So what that means, and this is in the report, I saw a couple of anecdotes and quotes from other folks that we interviewed, is that for especially young adolescents and young kids, it's like you almost develop a fatalistic view of the world. What is that doing to dampen the hope, the possibility, the opportunity for our young folks? Now, my son James is doing well right now, but it's still what this means is that what he has seen all his life and will continue to see is that he is undervalued. His life as a Black man, and my Black women as well that I'm raising are just, they're not seen as, it's almost like not human, right? And so what does that do for him when he's in the world trying to navigate and figure out what his future is? It limits what he sees himself as his ability to accomplish and do. And so that is my son talking, but that is our sons, our daughters, our communities. And so I think this is really important to figure out how we not only address, like you said, the actual firearm, all the the law enforcement, but what about the mental health and social services and the other things and the ways that we can as a community just kind of come together and make sure that our children understand what is possible.
Yeah, you talk about the ways that it impacts our children and our adolescents. I think back to when I lost my friend at 15 years old, and it forever shaped what my relationship was with firearms. I grew up in rural Southern Virginia, and guys would go hunting. It's the start of deer season just started. I never had an opportunity to view guns as a sport. To me, they were dangerous. To me, they took the lives of my friends and family members. And so I want you all to talk a little bit about how that trauma follows you from childhood to adolescence and into adulthood, and how it affects the way that we operate in our worlds, in our communities, and with each other.
I think one of the things that it does is it creates a numbing effect. When I was a kid, I used to be terrified of horror movies, and my brother thrived in placing me in situations where he was in supervision authority to make sure there was a horror movie on the screen just to see me react. I think back the other night, I was out with my youngest daughter, and a firework went off. We were at a game, and it went off. Another little girl was with us, and she just jumped and startled and didn't know what it was. And she was like, "Oh, I thought it was a gunshot." And I thought to myself, really? That sound at 9 years old is what you now equate. Anytime you hear it, that's a gunshot. It's not even a firework. It's not something exciting. That is now the equivalent of violence around me wherever I go. And I think that continues, that impacts us, that makes us determine, we look at crime trends, and then we determine where do we want to live. If we get to a place where we can move out of the neighborhood, we move out of the neighborhood. Then what happens to the neighborhood? We look at those impacts. We look at those schools. And so we have to look at those impacts and how they carry on, and they make those decisions as to what school I go to, and then when I get a job, where jobs are accessible to me, where do I live. That then comes back to how will that community thrive. And it can all be from an incident that started when I was much younger that has now shaped how I see and hear and experience the world every day.
And when I think about young children in particular, we know that having experience or witnessing or understanding or living in an environment where there's homicides taking place, that it does impair their ability to almost have kind of self-control. It does impair their cognitive ability oftentimes. And then when you think about those circumstances, they're in schools where oftentimes there is not enough support or resources so that folks can get the individual kind of attention that they need. So they end up being over-disciplined when really they're reacting from trauma. So you can see how this was just a vicious cycle that goes on. You go to school, like you said, you didn't even want to talk, or you're not engaging in participating, or you're failing, and it sets you on a path because no one's really digging in to say, what does this child need? What is happening? They're just trying to move kids along, and at a very young age, they start to place you kind of in categories, and sometimes very early on, they're saying that this child is just not gonna make it. This person's gonna fail. So I think if we really look at the micro, it's impacting in so many ways, and I'm really proud of this report, and the fact that we can start to kind of highlight and bring these things up so that we can come to some solutions together.
So you talk about solutions, and I have a question that's going to be wrapped up into a couple of questions that are going to be wrapped up into one. We talk about legislation that could possibly curb gun violence in our communities. We also know that there's a ton of dangerous gun legislation making its way through a lot of you all state houses, stand your ground laws, permitless carry that would allow people to carry loaded, concealed firearms without a permit or training in our communities. And we know that the issue of gun violence will only be exacerbated when laws like this are passed. And I look at that as those types of laws as some barriers. But one, what do you think are some legislative barriers to combating the issue of gun violence? And also, you talk about some of the solutions in the report and also in the work that you all have been doing.
Well, I'll take some legislative barriers possibly that you can look into, and I'll look at it from a victim's advocacy perspective. And I think about VOCA funding. One, that federal funding, ensuring that it's there, but then once it gets to your state, how accessible is it to a victim? And look at it from many angles. That is, there are barriers that have to do with a family member seeking victim's assistance when the person who is deceased is the individual they're evaluating. And they're determining, well, if he or she had a criminal record, well, now you cannot access these funds to support your family and continue on because of the record of the deceased. That barrier exists. That barrier is bureaucratic, and oftentimes it takes a year or more to be told, no, you can't access these funds. But after that, I've already incurred expenses, and at that point, the trauma, I'm being re-traumatized because now the system that I thought was in place to help support me has told me I have little to no value. And so looking at those opportunities to access those funds, timely access to those funds, is a lot of things that I hear from our gun violence survivors. They want to get access to those funds. I talked earlier about the notification. I appreciate what those officers are doing at that moment, but that's probably not the most opportune time to put the check in the box to say, I gave them the information. It's not the most opportune time. It may not be the most appropriate person. Again, there are ways that we can make information and resources available. Most of the time I hear from victims that they didn't even know the resources existed. So we have to look at how are we making the information available. I agree, we can't make everybody take advantage of those resources, but we need to make the information available. And I also look at it from the perspective of if we aren't making the information available and our community is not taking advantage of those resources, we run the risk of losing those resources. And so we need to look at how do we make sure we maximize access to those resources, particularly because they come often through the federal government to a state administering agency, and that state administering agency is where you all can have a specific impact on the policies and procedures that govern access to those funds.
And I think this is such a problem in our country that it requires all hands on deck. So it's definitely legislative and policy solution, but we also have to figure out the cultural pieces of it. We have to also figure out how we are working with the folks most impacted that are doing the work every day. One thing that was, I think this year that was exciting was with the president putting forward or requesting $5 billion over 8 years to be allocated to groups that are doing violence interruption in communities. It's really important work that's being done. I also think with the American Rescue Plan, I believe out of the money allocated, they want to put $200 million to go towards states to actually be able to kind of use this money, not like kind of discretionary for violence interruption. So I think it's a combination of the legislative and policy angles with some of the cultural and community and education angles that we need to get into. I think, again, as I've been stating, making sure that we're going across issues. So gun violence is associated with education, is associated with mental health and health care, is associated with economic opportunity. So I think as many opportunities we have to work across different issues and community with folks, that's where we're going to find our solutions.
And in accordance with that, what would your recommendations for lawmakers today to leave here and go back to their states to try to tackle this issue, particularly in some of our redder states where the issue has become so polarized that anything that is viewed as gun regulation or gun control is a non-starter. So I think about the Midwestern part of this country, the southern region, where it is a bit more difficult to broach the topic of gun violence prevention. What would your takeaway to lawmakers be today, day one after NBCSL leaving Atlanta, going back to their home states?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to repeat. I probably sound like a broken record, but I think the most important thing, because this is such a pervasive problem, it's not going to be a single thing that we're going to do that's going to erase the whole thing. But I will say, while we're trying to work on the legislative aspects, and we're here at Everytown to work in partnership with you to support anything from drafting model legislation, anything, we're here to work with you. But on top of that, I think working with the folks on the ground that are in the communities that are helping to intervene. I'm talking about the cure violence stuff. I'm talking about the hospital-based intervention. The funds that are coming into the states, making sure that they can get the access, that these groups and individuals that are working on this in the community, because we're going to need both of those things to make sure that not only we are stopping the violence, but we are getting to healing for our communities.
I think gun sense legislation is definitely an uphill battle. And so in order to play the long game, I've got to look directly at my community. And as Angela said, I've got to look at those violence interrupted programs. I've got to look at what's happening with those hospital-based programs so that we can get that information and we can address the problem at the grassroots, because our communities need relief now. They don't need debate now. They need the relief. And so what can we do? Those funds that are available right now, let's make sure they're getting to those organizations. Because they're doing great work. We're working with some of them, with my team right now in 26 cities, just looking at violence interrupted programs. What can be replicated? What works? What are some good ideas? We recognize that there's no one size fits all, but if you can come up with a great idea, let's share that idea. Let's get that information out there. And so that's one of those areas I would say is looking at those funds that are coming down to say, how do we make sure they get to the right people who are addressing the gun violence prevention problem in our communities so that we can make an impact and that direct impact. And those programs are looking at those cross issues. They're looking at access to food. They're looking at access to housing. They're looking at job development. So it's not just how do we stop the violence alone, but looking at those structural issues that are saying, how do we address the root cause of the violence in the community problem, and how do we address it? So that's the one area that I would say automatically is making sure you go back and you find out how are those funds getting to those organizations that are doing the work.
And I would just go on what you said about the kind of the multifaceted approach of these groups on the ground that are doing the work. One thing I remember very clearly from 2020 and even 2021, they're often not only the groups trying to stop and intervene when it comes to the violence, but they were the first on the ground for COVID relief, making sure people had information, masks, where are the testing sites. I mean, this was early on when folks were still quarantined and still figuring out. It felt like day by day we're getting new information. These same groups that are doing violence interruption in the streets were also making sure that communities had what they needed around COVID. So it is imperative that we're making sure that they have what they need to continue to serve communities.
Absolutely. I think one of the most important ways to frame this issue is as a public health issue. It is a public health issue of our time in the same way that COVID has been the last year and a half, in the same way that sickle cell, we've talked about over the course of the last couple of days, the diseases that plague our communities. Gun violence is a public health crisis of our time, and I think framing it around how it affects our mental, our physical, and our communities, and less about the actual firearm, which is, you know, a problem in our prevalence of firearms in our communities is a intense problem. But I think framing this in the most important way as a public health issue is one takeaway that I always try to talk with lawmakers about in the state houses that I'm in. I think now we're going to turn to question and answer portion, and also if there are any solutions or takeaways that you all have found in your communities and your states, would love to hear them. How are we going to?
Yeah.
Pass the mic around? Yeah. Do we need the mic?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm State Representative Carolyn Hughley from Columbus, Georgia. Welcome to Georgia. And over the course of the last couple of days, there was this story that stopped me cold of a 13-year-old who was manufacturing ghost guns and shot his sister. So what are we supposed to do about that? What does somebody have a solution, or has it been addressed somewhere? Because we will have a problem because the Democrats are in the minority, and when you start talking about guns or regulating or anything dealing with guns, our Republican colleagues set their hair on fire. Mm-hmm. But this whole notion that a 13-year-old could sit in his room and order the parts and make guns and have a gun selling business out of his mother's house, how do we address that?
Keenan, I'll start and I'll pass it to you. That is a very good question, and I'll be honest, I don't have all the answers, but we'll say this. It's one of the fastest growing, like having untraceable guns. This is no serial number, nothing. You can basically, one of the things that we've been trying to do at every town is to get them classified as, these parts classified as firearms, because they are not classified just for a simple thing. They don't have a particular hole drilled in a particular place means that it's not a firearm. And so you can get this and put it together. Anyone can access it, like you said, a kid, anybody, so it can get in the wrong hands. One of the things that we're doing, we have a lot of, I think, power. We're putting a lot of people power onto this issue in our organization, and we are leading from Everytown Law, one of our affiliates that is like trying to sue and do a lot of litigation around this. This is one angle. There's many more that we can do. And we're actually really looking to work with state legislators and others that are interested, mayors, any that are interested in even getting involved in litigation with us on some of these things. Again, very hard because they're untraceable, but we do have, for instance, some litigation happening in California. I think it's with Polymer 80, one of the leading distributors or where these parts are coming from. So if we can get the industry, if we can get and hold them accountable for getting these parts into the wrong hands, then we can start to have some, money talks, having these kinds of lawsuits. This is the kind of first step. But it is really a pervasive problem that we are constantly trying to explore. Again, it's something that we would love to have conversation with you all about what it looks like in your community and how we might help and support in that area.
Yeah, I will also add, I know in Illinois recently they just passed essentially universal background checks on all firearm sales, as well as a fix to their firearm relinquishment, firearm restraining order law. And if someone petitions for you to have for you to be separated from your firearm in case you're having suicidal ideations or wanting to harm others, the governor added in the ghost gun piece in there to make sure that since it is not technically classified as a firearm, to make sure that the pieces that make up a ghost gun are included in that relinquishment process. Now, we also know that the people who have a lot of these ghost guns have not filed them, registered them, so it doesn't cover the bulk of the ghost guns that we're seeing. I think in the city of Chicago, in the last 5 years, they said they had recovered maybe 100 ghost guns. This year alone, they've recovered 150. I think was the number that I saw, and so it is an increasing issue in our communities. And interestingly enough, the other group that we're seeing an increased usage of ghost guns with is the armed extremist groups that you saw on January 6th, storm the Capitol. So the dichotomy between which groups now have access to these unserialized weapons is growing, and it is a pervasive issue in our communities. But I think nibbling around the edges and adding it into those relinquishment laws, and then getting it to be classified as a firearm, or some of the ways legislatively that we might be able to tackle that issue.
Thank you. I'm Representative Laura Hall from Alabama. I would be interested in knowing if you've had conversations with the different groups, rap groups, et cetera. I had the experience just this past week. One of my colleagues showed me a video, members of a basketball team rapping and with guns. And in my mind, I'm assuming that it came from that. So I'm saying, have there been any type of conversations with those groups that identify with the violence or the carrying of guns and et cetera?
Yeah, good question. You can certainly jump in. I will say one of the things I oversee are cultural engagement in the organization. That means with athletic teams, sports teams, music, celebrities, and so we've increased our interaction and engagement, involvement, and partnership with some of these groups. And we have, there are Major League Baseball, there's NFL teams and others that are working with us. WNBA is one of our biggest, like in Washington, D.C., one of our biggest kind of supporters in trying to figure out, because they are also disproportionately impacted. A lot of these athletes have stories just like Keenan has. So we've been doing more work to kind of just be in partnership and figure out what we can be doing and how they can use their platform to actually speak and educate about gun violence in communities. So that's one of the things we're doing.
I think in addition to that national perspective, we've looked at it locally as well, as we talked about working with those violence interrupter programs. A lot of times they have direct inroads to young men, and they see them online, and they're first to know about it, and we've talked with them as well. And then we've also had some conversations with social media platforms to talk to them about filtering this type of material, because there are different instances where it may be retaliatory. There may be some preventive measures that can be put in place when this type of content is identified, even when it's the type of text or language that is used in a posting. It can provide some indicators. So we're working with some of those platform leaders to really develop some mechanisms and algorithms that will help potentially address some gun violence. In particular, like I said, the preventive one is we're looking at algorithms based on the text that's provided.
Greetings. I'm Theda Person from St. Louis, Missouri, out of Ferguson, Missouri. I'm the mother of missing child Christian Ferguson. I'm the president and founder of a nonprofit that I established in memory of my missing child, also murdered. I'm going through trial. The father has been charged with my son's disappearance after 16 years of his absence from life. But I'm also a victim of crime, a gun crime. I'm a victim of police brutality. I lost my nephew. He was murdered years ago, and when I was in grade school, I believe, that was the first time I became an activist. I attended a Stop the Violence march. A young lady on the street behind me in the hood. I grew up in the hood. I'm not in the hood now, but she was shot in the head, and that was just traumatic for me, you know, because I was like, I'm scared to walk around the corner to get my pickle. I used to love pickles. So I was scared, and one thing that I'm trying to, I guess my question to you is, what are you doing to collaborate with other organizations or nonprofits to address this issue? Because I see the importance because of my situation, but what is your organization doing to network with other organizations?
So specifically, when I think about it from a victim's perspective, we are working with local organizations, and a lot of those that are in our Everytown Survivor Network also have local organizations, and we're partnering with those organizations to help them and assist them with the violence prevention that they're working on. Some are doing it directly related to gun violence. Others have established foundations and nonprofits that are focused on addressing the food issue in their neighborhood, because they believe that was what really sustains their loved one's memory. And so we're working directly with those, particularly that are working with our Everytown Survivor Network. We've identified them, and where we can collaborate and help provide resources to help them reach and achieve their goals that cross those gun violence traits. That's what we're doing directly with them. So whether it's in Missouri or Texas or New York or Maryland or Florida, we have a network of survivors, and we're working with a lot of them who have established nonprofits. And additionally, those who have not, one of the things that we're looking to do in 2022 is assist them in establishing that, because a lot of them are saying, hey, we want to establish a 501c3, but we don't know how, we don't have the resources. And so one of the things that we're working is kind of giving them some workshops and seminars to help guide them through that process so that they're able to make application for various funds that are available to them. So that seems to be a barrier. One of those things we've invested in is providing that training and assistance to help them get their 501c3 certifications.
And I just want to just note that this trauma report was done in collaboration with the Black Mental Health Alliance, which is really important, so I want to shout them out. We also, as Keenan was saying, we work with a lot of national partners as well, other gun violence prevention organizations, other partners like Community Justice Action Fund, which focuses on Black and brown communities, which is really important for us because Everytown for Gun Safety is a broad Big Tent organization, but when we talk about the disproportionate impact, we have to be in lockstep and in partnership with folks that are directly on the ground within the communities doing this. I'd also say we have an interfaith council that has folks from all over the country, that some of them have their own organizations, and we work with them. And then lastly, of course, Moms Demand Action. We have volunteers in all 50 states that work very closely with partners locally on the ground. So.
Hey, I'm Gilda Cobb Hunter, South Carolina House, and thank you for the information. And to the sister from St. Louis, sorry for what you've gone through and are still going through. Which leads me to my question. The gentleman mentioned some simple things that in states like South Carolina, where getting gun legislation passed is pretty difficult. I was intrigued by your comment about who brings the information to the person that they've lost a loved one through gun violence, and would really appreciate if some of those simple things that you alluded to in your comments earlier could be provided to us, so that, for example, it would be really easy to go into our crime victims compensation, our whole victims of crime at the state level, and add language that says notification must be done by social workers, somebody other than law enforcement. And so if there are some examples like that those of us who are trying to make a difference in these deep red states could do, that would be real helpful. And it would come across as non-threatening because they all think they care about victims of crime, and it'd be real difficult, I think, for them to turn that down. Thank you.
Hello, I wanted to say thank you to NBCSL for making this a topic that we...
Let them finish.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. We can do that. We're good. We'll make that happen. We'll take the question.
Thank you. Once again, I wanted to thank for putting this topic on the schedule to be speaking about. I took some notes real fast while I was sitting here because sometimes, getting where you're trying to go, you got to have a bit of a plan. I've been doing, first, my name is Issa Shaheed. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we have a serious gun violence issue, homicide issue in our city. We now at about 5, I've been here since Monday, so I'm pretty sure the numbers have changed since I got on my plane. 510 homicides in the city of Philadelphia, and it's constantly growing. I grew up in an inner city community, North Philly, the Strawberry Mansion area, and I see a lot of things that go on. It's been a while since I've spoken in one of these types of settings because I started to understand the pen and beginning to write programs and writing proposals and putting things into play. I founded a nonprofit organization, Muslims for Humanity, Muslims number 4 humanity, to get more of our Islamic communities and interfaith bodies involved in the process, the grassroots level process. One thing that my good friend up there said was finding the root cause of the issue. And I will say the root cause, my experience of finding the root cause, is poverty. And we are not addressing the issue of poverty properly. Now, during my work with Muslims for Humanity, an organization that I founded and was the president of, people seen my work in the community, and I was snatched up. You have something that we want, a gift to relate with, engage with people, and now I'm with the Labor District Council. Why? I believe, I don't know, but I believe because I offered jobs. I went through my community and I developed programs, beautification programs that will bring young men off of the street corners and offer them something, a job. I was able to say, hey, nephew, come here for a second. I have a job for you. So we started working with the Commerce Department of Philadelphia. I started that pen again, applying for grants and contracts. I got you. We getting there. Sometimes we have to have a plan to get where we're going. The thing is, we need to be, what are some of the things that you could provide to add to jobs, to fix the problem of poverty, creating jobs. How do we do that? And that, to me, would be the solution to our gun violence, gun safety issues.
I will just say this, thank you, first of all. What I will say is one of the things that we've started to do in the organization, recognizing that our bread and butter and our main focus is gun violence prevention, but also knowing that you can't do gun violence prevention without having an understanding of, like you said, root cause and all the intersections of that, is what we call parallel movement work, which means that our other organizations, our sister organizations that might be doing food insecurity or might be doing housing or might be doing economic justice work, we are trying to figure out how we are working together with like almost a united wall to kind of push on this problem together and to kind of think about the solution, not just from one angle, but from a multi kind of view of the problem. So I think you're absolutely right. Poverty is a big piece of this. Lack of opportunity, education, healthcare, all those things come into play. And we're constantly looking at what our role is as our organization to help contribute to kind of making sure that we're cracking the nut and getting to the problem and not just putting Band-Aids on things. So thank you for your comments. There's always more to do and always more to kind of dig into, but we're very aware of it and we're trying to figure out the best way to leverage our resources to do good in that area.
The moderator just said two more, so we already had two more, her in the back and then her. So forgive for those who didn't get got.
Hello, my name is Dottie Joseph, and I represent Miami, Florida. My question for you is twofold. One is, what resources do you have, either on your website or wherever, for legislators that are looking to dig in some of these issues deeper and to do some of the nibbling around the edges that you referred to earlier? So that's one. And the second question is, what, if anything, is being done to handle or address the obvious, or maybe not so obvious, but obvious to us, political aspect of this with respect to the NRA, because their approach to this is a double-barreled approach, one of which has to do with funding. And, you know, the sister mentioned earlier about being in a deep red state. Ours isn't deep red, it's purplish, but it's leaning more red every day. And all of that makes these kinds of reforms near impossible, no matter how sensible they are. So what, if anything, is being done, maybe if not by you, but by any partners, to counterbalance that?
I'll take a little bit of that to start off, since I am in a lot of these state houses. Like I said, I cover Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And you know, people often talk to me about if we get rid of the NRA, and then everything will be, you know, we can get things in place. And I say, well, there are about 50 different NRAs in any given state. You know, Ohio has Buckeye Firearms. They got Badgers for guns. In Wisconsin, you know, the list goes on and on. The number of different smaller factions of gun lobby groups that have been created, and they have infiltrated the state houses, the committee hearings. They do the email blasts and phone blasts. I think some of our tactics have been shame and blame. You know, as much as members who are in bed with those groups can be shamed and blamed into backing off with their relationships with them. We've tried to use that Freedom of Information Acts to see how much they are speaking with organizations to align them to align the number of training hours that a teacher might have. You know, I'm working on a bill right now in Ohio that would allow that would essentially zero out the training requirements for teachers in a school district if they are to be armed. And the bill drafters work very closely with an organization that is a NRA-like organization in the state. And our litigation team called for a Freedom of Information Act on the committee members on that committee, and to try to use the shame tactic of them being closely aligned. So that's something that we're working on. It is a prevalent issue, as you brought up, and there is no one way to combat it, but.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd say we do a lot of, I mean, that's one thing our organization, if there's anything I can lift up, is digging into the NRA's AAASS. is a big deal because we've been able to pull back all the dirty dealings of the NRA in the recent years, and they have sustained a lot of blows. They've lost a lot of membership because basically they're taking in people's money and just living large, and not really helping the people. We've also seen a lot of the ways that they have fueled the fire when it comes to racism and having terrible ads that are just kind of dog whistle kind of stuff when it comes to get yourself armed because of all of us. So we constantly have our eye on that, and if any of you want any more information or you want us to support you and work around chipping away at any of the local groups or NRAs in your area, please let us know. I think for online resources that was also asked, that's something we can also send to you. We have lots of things from this trauma report is in it. We have tracing platforms. We have all kinds of amazing things. We have an entire research arm of our organization that's constantly digging into this information. So I would say, please kind of get with one of us and we can make sure that we get information. We'd love to just blast it to all of you, but there's plenty of stuff for us to share with you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jasmine Clark. I'm a state representative here in Georgia, in Gwinnett County. And recently, in another county here in Georgia, we had a 13-year-old boy who was able to buy all the parts to make guns and literally had a makeshift business where he was making guns and selling them, basically selling these ghost guns. And so what does Everytown or any of these organizations have in place to basically keep up with technology and how easy it is for people to get access to parts so they can just make their own guns? In this case, this child killed his sister because someone tried to rob him, and he's shooting at them. He ends up killing his own sister. So my question is just, what are we doing about, things are moving so fast. And is there anything that you all have in place specifically about the ghost gun stuff? And then my second question really quick was, you mentioned a money figure earlier where you said it costs, I think you said $280 billion. What exactly are the specific line items that money is being spent on? Because I think that message would resonate with some people.
No, absolutely. We have a breakdown of the economic cost of gun violence on our website, and I can share that with you. But some of the breakdown: $3.5 billion for medical costs, immediate and long-term medical care, mental health care, and ambulance and patient transport. $10.7 billion for police and criminal justice costs. So that's police response and investigation, court administration staff, and incarceration. About $500,000 in employer costs. Employer costs for lost revenue and productivity, $51.2 billion in work loss cost, income loss because of death, and then $214 billion in quality of life costs, pain and suffering. We talk about the scars that you can't see. So that's a little bit of a breakdown. A ton of wasted money when we could be doing a lot more on the front end to prevent this.
The moderator said he can ask one more question because y'all know somebody else asked that other question that she asked.
Let me just say this really quickly. Yes, the ghost guns question was asked. We're happy to get with you afterwards, but we're doing a lot of litigation on it. We're fully aware of it, and we are one of the leading organizations trying to figure out the technology pieces and partnering with corporations and other partners to figure out how we get ahead of this.
Thank you for that. Thank you, man. I'm State Representative Antonio Parkinson out of Tennessee, chair of Tennessee Black Caucus. I'm a pro-gun Democrat with common sense. We passed open carry this year. I didn't support it, and I still don't support it. But one of the things that I made during, one of the statements I made during the floor debate, and I apologize if this has already been discussed, was to put money into the budget for free gun safety training for our people, because our people, I think, will fall victim to these laws based on ignorance of the law. We already got people out there that are shooting because they feel like they can shoot if someone steals the bike, or if a crime that did not prove or show any harm to them was being enacted on their property. And so we were able to get, I think, $500,000 put into the budget for free gun safety training, and I think we need to take advantage of that. One of the things, you can learn a lot from these white folks, y'all. Sorry, white folks that's in the building. But one thing I learned from them is this: when we were still doing permits, I took my 11-year-old daughter with me to the gun safety training class, for me to get my permit. And she actually went through the class, took the test, obviously not old enough to receive her permit, but she passed the test. That's how easy the test was. But the good thing about that was, since then, and I took her into the range so she could shoot also. And I started out with 9mm 32, and then police issue SIG 40, so she can feel it. I wanted her to feel the power of that gun, right? And now from that, she understands, even still to this day, she's 17 now, still to this day, you know, the importance of that gun safety, the importance of how to handle or when not to handle or not to handle a gun if she sees it in the house. And I never had to worry about that. I had more of a statement than a question, brother. I appreciate you, man. But thank you. I just wanted to put that out there. Budget for free gun safety training for our people. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right. I was just going to say you're absolutely right. To that point, the fastest growing population of gun owners in this country is black women. And there is a gap between us and groups like the NRA on reaching that particular group of people on education. I have to add that Every Time for Gun Safety is a bipartisan, nonpartisan, pro-Second Amendment, pro-safe, reasonable firearm ownership organization. And so I think to that point, brother, absolutely, the education is the biggest piece. And our community, I think when you talk about, I hear often the good guy with a gun and a bad guy with a gun, and we know who they are talking about, but absolutely being armed and educated, I think is the best way that we can, one of the better ways that we can combat this epidemic.
So can I just, I'm sorry, I'm Senator Pat Spearman from great state of Nevada.
Yes.
We're looking forward to you all coming there next year. So 3 things, and this is what I always start, and I've carried several pieces of legislation, and I guess about 80% of it has gotten passed with regard to common sense gun safety. My oldest and my youngest brother were both Marines. And I say that because they're no longer with us, because the other thing that they had in common was my oldest and my youngest brother were also murdered by people who had no business having a gun. My oldest brother was murdered 1 week after he got back from Vietnam, trying to stop a fight. It's first thing. Second thing, after I give my opening statement for my bills, I have a bunch of my brothers and sisters who are veterans come to the table and talk about what it means to stand and actually serve to protect the Second Amendment. And I have called to task some people who show up in camouflage, and they bought it from the Army surplus store. And so I tell them I got set, and mine is real. I didn't go out and try to play soldier. I actually was a soldier to protect your right. And so I think one of the things that we keep missing is we're going to the messaging piece, and we're asking people to pay attention to the heartstrings. And when you're talking about cray-cray, they don't understand heart. And so get veterans involved and talk about really what this Second Amendment thing means, and talk about our experience. You know, some of us that have been to combat. This is what is real. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times what happens when you start talking about, well, we got to do this because it's going to protect, they don't care. Mm-hmm. But when I bring the veterans to the table, and then when I give the benediction on the bill, then a lot of them have to go away. And I also say this third thing. I say, you all always talk about, because, you know, we want to do gun safety laws, that we want to take your gun. That's not true. I used to own a house with a swimming pool. There were laws that I had to abide by for the swimming pool. They weren't coming to get my pool. They just needed to make sure my pool was safe for the community. So I think a lot of the messaging, you know, if we lead with the people who have already been to war, lead with the people who have stood up, you know, to protect the Second Amendment, a lot of these people that run around to the Army surplus store and get the camouflage and stuff like that, you know, son, sit yourself down.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for your service. And I will say, that is brilliant. We have the Veteran Advisory Council we work very closely with, and I think that's right. One of the things they always say is the training, safety, and accountability. That is what you learn in the military. I have military in my family as well, and they range from across political spectrum. But the bottom line is they know what it means to handle. They have been trained on firearms. They know what it means. They know the impact, like you said, like your daughter knows, and they think it's ridiculous that anyone can have their hands on it. They also note that when they were in the military and when they were, kind of on base, they couldn't just carry their weapon all around. That wasn't what they did. So we are working with them, and we'd love anything that you want to give us or any way we can partner. I think it's brilliant, and we need to do more of it. Thank you.
Well, I thank you all for joining us today. Keenan and Angela, thank you all both for presenting. And again, I said this to start off the session, but I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to be here with my people. You know, I've never wanted anything more than the love and acceptance of my people. I'm very proud to be in a room with such dynamic leaders in all facets of our communities. And I am tasking myself personally with reacquainting and reconnecting myself with every Black lawmaker in my state that I handle, in every community initiative, Black-led community initiative in our issue area and all the issues that lend itself to gun violence. And I thank you all. I love you. I love my people. I really appreciate you all this week. Thank you.